Welcome to part one of USC's Rossier series, An Equitable Restart, Back to School, Not to Normal. Before we begin, I would like to review the process for submitting a question to our panelists. Please type your questions in the Q&A box that can be accessed by clicking on the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen. We will reserve some time towards the end for conversation for your questions, and we hope to get to as many as possible. Closed captioning is available for this event. Please use the caption icon at the bottom of your screen to access it. Lastly, please note a recording of this webinar will be available after the event. Now please join us in welcoming our moderator, Pedro Nogueira, Dean of the USC School of Education.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Kane, for the introduction, and thank all of you for tuning in today for this important session. But we know that finally, our policymakers have recognized that you really can't restart the economy without reopening schools in some form. But we really haven't addressed all of the issues that would entail. And so now we have a scramble that mostly affects school districts for how to do so well. Today's event will focus on how to do so equitably, so we can ensure that all children, regardless of their backgrounds, have access to learning during this very uncertain period that we find ourselves in. So as we say in the title of this event, we want to return not to normal, but hopefully to something better and more equitable. Today we've assembled a panel of experts. We have first Austin Beutner, Superintendent of Los Angeles Unified School District, the second largest district in the nation. Austin, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Vivian Ekchian, who is the Superintendent of Glendale Public Schools and has been an educator in this region for many years, and we appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
And also joining us is Professor Shaun Harper. Professor Harper is the director of the Center for Race and Equity at USC. Thank you, Shaun, for being with us.
Thank you, Dean Nogueira.
And Professor Mary Helen Immordino-Yang, who is also on the faculty at USC and the director of a center there. Mary Helen, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start with a question that I'd like to pose to our two superintendents, because you're obviously the decision makers, you're on the front line. Austin, I know you've already gotten in some heat from the White House for some of your positions on this. So I've been reading a lot, like many others, that we don't really face a lot of good options here with respect to how to open schools. So as you're thinking about it, let's leave the logistics aside. There was an article that came out yesterday showing that literally many kids, most of them Black and Latino kids, did not participate in much learning at all during the quarantine in the spring. What kind of measures are you and Ms. Ekchian taking? I'll start with you, Austin, and then go to Vivian, taking to ensure that we're doing as good a job as possible to ensure that all kids have access to a safe and hopefully a good education come August.
Sure. And again, thank you for having me. And Pedro, congratulations. Karen Gallagher leaves big shoes to fill, but USC is really privileged to have you in those big shoes. And Mary Helen and Shaun, great to be with you. And we do a lot of work together, so it's great to be back together. Let me get context before we get to online, because what happens when the tide comes out of the harbor is you expose those ragged shoals. And here we're seeing what we've known for some time, which is there's big disparities in how Black and Latino children are treated in public education, which existed well before we transitioned to this mode. They have been made worse. We did a survey of the families we serve, of whom about 80% live in poverty. And this survey is now about 6 weeks old. At that time, more than half the families had lost work due to the virus. So we knew going in, we had to do more and different. The first thing we did was to make sure we connected every student, not inconsequential with 500,000 students, not just a device, but internet access. And much has been talked about the digital divide. Well, we had to get our students across and reconnected. Shouldn't be something school districts uniquely are equipped to do or funded to do, but we did. So each and every one of our students was provided with a device and the connection to come back to their school committee. That's table stakes, shouldn't have been so hard, but it hadn't been done before we did that. The second was to make sure that we did the same effort with families. So teachers, support staff, educators in our schools made sure to reach out to make sure we had that same dialogue reestablished with families to participate. We're going to need to do more. We've seen lots of studies of Los Angeles Unified and other school districts where that disparity that existed before is made worse because so many of our families are not in a home circumstance like just looking at the screen. We're all privileged. We've got a roof over our head. We know where the next meal is coming from. We have a stable internet connection. It's relatively quiet. Those conditions don't exist in the households of so many of the families we serve. So there's work to do. I'd say we're in early innings and we're trying to bring forward some of the learnings from March to June. We had summer school for the first time ever for any student who wanted in Los Angeles Unified. We learned, as well as our students learned. August will be a new chapter, but it has to be a better chapter.
Thank you for that, Austin. And Dr. Ekchian, I neglected to mention you're one of our graduates from Rossier. So what about in Glendale? What are some of the challenges you're facing as you think about reopening, less on the logistics, more on some of the educational and equity issues?
So it's great to be part of this conversation today, of course, because we have one common purpose, which is to make sure that all of our students are college, career, and life ready, and not allow this pandemic to become a setback for them. So I believe, and we all believe in Glendale together, that education will never go back to the way it was before. So we have to ask ourselves, are those who are most directly affected at the table when decisions are made? And are the voices and choices of parents and students heard and honored? So when we look at the significant variation that exists among school districts with regard to online device availability, connectivity, and individual student, family, and educator needs, it's difficult to create a uniform approach to equitable distance learning. Of course, having spent many years in LA, I recognize the size and the complexity of it. And then I look at a school district that is the third largest in LA County, and I say, how do we do it? We had to distribute 8,000 devices. We had to come up with 500 hotspots. We've been serving meals constantly, and the number of meals increases tenfold, and the staffing required to be able to do it with the protections that many of our staff members equitably also are honoring. We are in a crisis to make sure that we are able to consistently meet the needs of our students and families. Academically, it is particularly difficult because what's becoming even more evident that our students of color and students who've been historically underserved and our English language learners, our students with special needs, have difficulty receiving the same differentiation that they would have if they had been in seat. So being able to offer the variations of strategies and pedagogy during a distance learning period of time that pretty much took place overnight, we had a digital divide. So we've ordered 10,000 devices because we don't want the fall to be what the spring looked like. And we have planned training for our educators a week in advance of the school year so that we're not doing the training while they're trying to teach, which was very stressful. We had schools that didn't have difficulty at all because they had gone through years of training on how to use distance learning. And then we had schools where it was difficult for everyone because that had not been the focus. So it's really taught us a lesson to close the digital divide no matter what happens. And we've had educators who've given us strategies on what to do next, and we are really counting on those choices and voices to incorporate into the plan for the fall.
Thank you for that, Vivian. And I want to commend both superintendents. I know that you've both been delivering meals to thousands of people across the Los Angeles. So, you know, that's vital, not only for the children, but for their families. So thank you for that. I want to turn to Shaun Harper, my colleague there at the Center for Race and Equity. Shaun, what are some of the other equity issues that are not perhaps being recognized that are also impacting children and families during this period?
Yeah, Dean Nogueira, I appreciate you asking this question. I have gone down the rabbit hole of going and searching for as many school reopening plans as I can find. And at this point, I've now read dozens. And so much attention is being understandably placed on instructional needs, placed on reconfiguring classrooms and labs to allow for physical distancing. All of those things are absolutely important. But there are some racial equity considerations that are not getting nearly as much attention as they should be. One of those is the inequities between schools. And given the ways that the racial composition of schools tends to commingle with, underfunding, for particular schools that disproportionately educate Black and brown kids, I'm now suddenly wondering, do they in fact have the resources that they need to equitably ensure physical distancing? I was on the phone with the head of school of a very well endowed private independent school a couple of weeks ago, and she was apologizing because there was banging in the background and she was afraid that it was disruptive. And she explained to me that the banging was that there were construction workers there reconfiguring the classrooms and labs to allow for physical distancing. In the moment that she said that, I thought about the under-resourced schools that I've visited here in LA, in New York City, in Philadelphia, and other places, and wondered, were construction workers in those schools reconfiguring classrooms and labs in the same way? Did they have the same kinds of resources? So I think we got to pay very careful attention to the resource inequities across schools. I think we also have to pay more attention to the actual school staff. So many plans, again, have been rightly focused on students and trying to figure out ways to even bring students in shifts on particular days at particular times. But if we think about who the essential workers are in schools, they're disproportionately Black and Latino and lower income Asian Americans who are the custodial workers, the food service workers, the groundskeepers, people who have to keep schools clean, right? So we have to think about, if we are having these essential workers coming to school buildings much more regularly, interacting with each other and with students, and then they're going back home to their communities, potentially having been exposed to COVID-19, I think that, schools may be a source of exacerbating the kinds of racial disproportionality that we've seen in the health outcomes. So those are just two examples of things that immediately come to mind for me.
Thank you for that. And I want to turn to you now, Dr. Immordino-Yang, Mary Helen. You're a neuroscientist, and I know you study and look at the ways in which the brain is affected through learning. And we know that many kids, and the Pediatricians Association has warned us, that many kids are suffering from not being in school. What are some of the risks associated with online learning for kids who already have experienced the anxiety and uncertainty of the pandemic, and who in many cases are isolated? What are some of the things we should be concerned about, both with respect to learning and to mental health?
Yeah, thank you, Dean Nogueira, for asking that really important fundamental question. I'm going to take it back to a moment that you said at the very beginning, which is that so many Black and brown kids especially didn't have opportunities to learn this spring. And I'm going to push back on that and say they're learning a lot, but they're not learning what we intend for them to learn. Because in our brain, the very same mechanisms and platforms that fuel our bodily survival, that regulate our consciousness and our health, and that are involved in physiological processes that literally support our well-being and our growth and our ability to flourish as human beings in relationships and in cultural groups and also cognitively, intellectually, are completely intertwined. And when kids are cut off from opportunities to associate with their peers, from adults who care about them, who are engaged in teaching them to think in new ways and about new information, and really stretching what they're engaging with cognitively and affectively, and who they believe themselves to be and who they're capable of in the future, all of that is literally shaping, our research and others suggests, is literally shaping the very same neural substrates that are also involved in maintaining basic cognitive and emotional health and physiological well-being. And so what we really see here is a public health crisis that comes from the social disconnection that kids are being forced into. And also that is weighing very heavily on our teachers and the adults in the system, like Dr. Harper suggested, that everyone in this world right now is feeling very unsettled, very unmoored. And what that does is not separate from your ability to do intellectual things. It's actually using up your cognitive processing power and literally teaching your brain how to grow into a sort of warning instrument that's like an alarm bell that is just getting you more and more worried about what's happening on, more and more ruminative about the possible futures that could happen, right? And when those kinds of thoughts are left sort of to run amok without the structures and the relationships and the reassurances of a school community that cares about you, that's invested in you, with adults and structures that are really supporting you to make something of yourself, this has really profound implications for how children feel and how they learn now and into the future.
Pedro, can I jump back in real quick on this one? Mary Helen has me thinking about Grace Cowell is one of my favorite sociologists. She's at Yale. She and some of her colleagues wrote a really important essay about the racial violence that Asians and Asian Americans have experienced throughout the pandemic. You know, Mary Helen has me thinking about you know, these school reopening plans, whether they're virtual or, you know, a return to physical in-person schooling, we have to have a plan for how do we also protect Asian Americans and Asian students from the violence and the trauma that may await them because of the stereotypes that people have about them and the ways in which people are very wrongly associating them with the coronavirus. We got to make sure that we have, you know, the appropriate mental and emotional support resources for those students and employees.
Thank you for a reminder of that, because we know the incidents of that kind of anti-Asian incidents have been on the rise. I want to turn back to the superintendents now and just ask, we know the pressure is on from the federal government without much guidance. How much guidance do you feel you're getting from the state of California about how to reopen schools safely and carefully? We know that some districts, Orange County said that they can go back to school without masks. Today, the governor said, no, masks are going to be required. But I'm just wondering, because we know that some governments have done open schools safely and managed to pull it off. Some have had a disaster. Austin Beutner, what are your thoughts on that? About the guidance.
If we can take the politics out and focus on the science fact, not the science fiction, the science is actually pretty clear around what gets us back to schools. Okay, World Health Organization has a published standard. If the rate of infection is at or below 5%, start making your way back. If it's above, stay home. Pretty clear. And that shouldn't be at odds. In Los Angeles, we're twice that. And that needs to be shared with our community, understood. When that's coming back in the right direction, we can go back. Now, the piece that's still missing, which I think ties together a lot of these pieces, is how do we go back? Okay, a lot of talk about the need to put the painter's tape on the floor, wear the mask, clean every surface, what I'll call better health practices, basically to keep people further apart. That's where the inequities come in, because I read an article this morning, Punahou in Hawaii, they've got 2 teachers in every class, plenty of facilities, they can all go back because they can all spread out. We can't. Okay, the inequities manifest themselves there. There are 2 other legs to the stool, which is testing and contact tracing. Shaun makes a very smart point. We have essential workers at schools. Why are we not testing essential workers to come back to school to keep them safe as a health imperative, and also to bring safely back our students who should also be tested? And that third leg is the contact tracing. Contact tracing hasn't gone so well in many communities for a simple reason. Random contacts. I get sick, I take a public bus to the hospital. Good luck figuring out who else was on that public bus with me, if I could even remember the number of the bus I was on. Schools are defined around cohorts. So we're ideally situated, those 12 kids plus their teacher in a classroom, one of them becomes ill, all 13 need to be kept home or isolated for a period of time. We can do that. We can reach out to each of their families because a phone call from a school, we're trusted. They'll take the phone call, not, hi, we're from the government here to help. But I think what gets us, Pedro, back to a place to address the imperative that Mary Helen raises, which is we have a health crisis becoming a public education crisis with a health crisis for students attached. The mental health needs of our students are great. The best recipe is to get back to school fast. And my view is all three ingredients need to be in place. The practice, yes, testing, tracing, which takes us back sooner and safer.
Thank you for that. Vivian, let me ask you this question because almost as devil's advocate. If parents are going to have to go back to work, and many of the parents of our kids, particularly low-income kids, are essential workers, they need childcare. They can't work. Unlike many professionals who, like myself, I work and my daughter's Zooming online. We have parents who are workers whose kids will be unsupervised. What kinds of arrangements, even if we can't bring them back to school safely, can we make to assure that kids will be in a safe, supervised setting?
Yeah, so I'm so glad you asked that question because this coronavirus experience has also been an opportunity for us to innovate. So just last Tuesday, our Board of Education approved a program that we want to start on August 19th, which is introduction of technology pods into our school sites. Although we have made the decision because of our listening learning tour and public health orders to be distance learning at first, we are inviting parents. We just send a letter out to them and they're weighing in elementary level of those that need childcare. Included in that would be our own employees. And we started that July 1st for our classified employees who came back sooner. It's for essential workers and our students who are on free and subsidized meals, also our homeless students and foster. We are, within hours, we had more than 600 right away say that they were interested. So we hope to have those at their own individual school sites with the same public requirements of PPE, masks, physical distancing, meals served in the classroom. This will be, in a way, a transition to see what that could really look like, because of course we fleshed out a hybrid plan for the future when it's time. But this gives our students and their parents a voluntary opportunity at the elementary level to benefit from childcare. But the real issue is being able to facilitate the use of a device, because many of our parents are unable to serve our students. They did not turn into teachers overnight. There may be language barriers, they may have to go to work, or they have multiple kids. So many family situations are complicated. So we're excited to learn from this experience that can then inform us about the fall, should we be able to go into a hybrid model. But it's the first time we've ever done this. We started with 2 schools July 1st, and so far we've been very pleasantly surprised about how well it's been received. And we've also offered it now to our hospital workers in the community and our city of Glendale. And we're trying to make the success of our youth a city-wide effort and not so much about the school district versus any other municipality.
Thank you for that. Shaun, I want to follow up on that because some of what Vivian is raising, it has to do with another set of equity concerns, and that is how certain kinds of kids, groups of kids have been impacted. We know kids with learning disabilities typically don't do well online learning. We know English language learners, especially if the quality of what they get is not good, will also suffer. And then early learners, kids who are learning to read. How should equity concerns figure into how we address the needs of those groups of kids?
Sure. I would say that equity has to be in the forefront of our plans and strategies for effectively educating those kids, as opposed to back-ending equity. You know, Pedro, I appreciated the examples that you gave. I'll add one more group of people who are not likely to learn well, is students who are grieving and students who are depressed. One of the things that we know is that COVID-19 mortalities has disproportionately affected communities of color. So therefore, it is highly likely that students of color and employees of color are going to come back to any version of schooling, virtual or in person, grieving more so than their white counterparts. So we have to be really thoughtful about, how do we get a kid to learn who is still mourning the loss of a grandparent, a parent, a sibling, or other people in their community.
Yeah, that's very important. Mary Helen, let me ask you a question about the parents. Some have said, well, this is a great opportunity for parents and kids to bond. But as we know, anybody who's done it knows that this is a tall order. Parents aren't trained to be teachers for the most part. And many parents are reporting great stress at home, in the relationship. What advice should we give to parents about how to provide this support while you're also juggling the responsibilities of work and managing a home? What are your thoughts about parents in this period?
Yeah, oh boy. I mean, I think what you're really highlighting is that we're all really, really in this together. I mean, and so, as a community, we need to come together and support everybody across the levels, because if we don't do that, then nobody's fully supported. I think what I would remind parents, first of all, is that what really, really matters, first and foremost, to holding your family together well and to holding yourself and your own health together well, is helping people feel connected, feel supported, feel loved, feel like they have what they need, relationally speaking. And that is a very difficult thing to do under the duress that we're under, and that so many families are so strained right now. But what really matters is not so much the stuff you can provide or even the instructional time you can provide, but first really supporting kids who are grieving, when you're grieving, right? Really being willing to go there and talk about these things and really support each other through it. Because the number one thing, and this is true also in virtual learning environments, or when we do come back to real seated learning environments, the number one thing is people need to feel like they belong. And even if we're all forced to be sitting far apart, or we're forced to be cut off from our friends, our churches, our support mechanisms, we need to find ways to really consciously give time and effort to making each other feel like we're in it together and like we will get through this. That's extremely important. And I think also as parents, by focusing on that, you can actually work with your kids. I mean, I am fortunate to have enough financial means, right, to be able to really do okay when we're distanced. But I'm also living with two teenagers shoved in a house together, right, who can't go anywhere with their friends. And I think what has helped is us thinking together about what can we do. Everybody, no matter what situation you're in, can do something small to help somebody else, to help each other, to help out around the house, to help a neighbor, to help a member of your parish or your block. And if you can do something and be looking always for that, it really does have benefits back for your own mental health. It helps you feel purposeful again. It helps you feel like this. We're not just at the recipients of all this evil, but we can actually take control of our world and dig back in an agentic way and start to build it back up into the world we want to have again. And that kind of switch in mental orientation means everything to our mental health, and really shifts the light that we shine on these really difficult circumstances to one of challenge from one of threat. So it doesn't mitigate the actual threat, it doesn't make you actually safer, but it makes you feel better. And in doing that, it makes you healthier and puts you in a better position to actually move forward in a way that we do support one another.
May I build on that, Pedro?
Sorry, go ahead, Vivian.
Trauma-informed instruction, trauma-informed strategies, there are things we can do for our students, with our students and families within our distance learning element that really helps, because the assumption is that all of our students did not have trauma to begin with. While we know our underserved students had trauma to begin with, and now this is another dose in a different way. So predictability, stability, having self-regulation strategies in place. There are many things we are introducing and continuing to emphasize in our schools through our educators and other staff that supports the idea of our students feeling safe. So that sense of belonging can only happen if you had it to begin with. So now that you are challenged by the pandemic, it's even more important to look at trauma-informed strategies across our systems so that our students feel safe.
Yeah, I think that Vivian makes such an important point. You know, I like the not to normal part of the title for this event, because the truth is, before the pandemic, so many students of color especially felt the insufficient sense of belonging in their schools. So as we think about a return to schooling, we have to also think about how it affords us an opportunity to be much more thoughtful about engendering a strong sense of belonging and inclusion for those who have long felt like they were on the fringes of their schooling experiences.
Thank you. Austin, I have a question because in addition to a pandemic, we're also in the midst of a movement for racial justice that swept the country following the murders of George Floyd and others. I was thinking, you know, had schools been open when those incidents occurred, kids would have come back having seen those images on social media, wanting to talk about it in school. They're going to come back eventually and will want to raise it. Do you think our teachers are prepared to have conversations about this movement, about what's occurring in the country right now?
Let me just note, while this was occurring, our teachers were having conversations. So we weren't physically together, but we were together, and we put in a lot of time to make sure that, as appropriate at different levels, those conversations were occurring. In addition, we're doing a bunch of work, and actually Dr. Harper, thank you, is part of an effort to make sure that we train and retrain our leadership and train those who are with students about these types of conversations, but also what we can do indeed, not just in word. So we are retraining school leaders, and each of them have an equity project, something demonstrative for their school community as a way to show what that bright light looks like, whatever it might be, unique to their community that we're working on. Dr. Nogueira, thank you for being part of a group we have working on other ways that we need to change, because the conversation about institutional bias, systemic racism, which we know exists, that conversation's been happening as long as all of us have been alive. The question is, what can we do as educators about it? And I'll give one simple example, concrete example. We have had in Los Angeles Unified for a period of years an ethnic studies curriculum. We led the state, thank you actually Dr. Ekchian and others who helped create that, but it's an elective. A small portion of our high schoolers take it. We have this other path called civics, which is a requirement. Every 12th grade in the state of California takes it, but if you look at the curriculum, there's no mention of the Greenwood Massacre in Tulsa. There's no mention of Juneteenth. There is no discussion about how redlining and zoning in communities has created this disparity of funding that Dr. Harper spoke of between communities of color for public education and other communities. So we're working to change how we teach civics, because every student, every conversation needs to be imbued with what we can do. What's my own individual action to be part of the change we want to see? So the conversation will continue, but we hope in the weeks and months, not months and years, in the weeks and months to come, through demonstrable actions, whether it is changing civics curriculum, looking at the naming of David Starr Jordan High School, one of our schools named after the founding president of Stanford, also one of the leading proponents of eugenics. So we're working with that community to rethink those types of issues. So work to be done beyond the conversation, I guess. Deeds.
Dr. Ekchian, do you want to add to that at all about, you know, and how are those issues? Because while the focus has been on Black lives, because Black people in particular have felt the brunt of the police brutality, we know that the questions of racial justice and understanding America is something, I think, and Austin Beutner spoke to that, something everybody should know about. There should be a level of racial literacy and an understanding that all kids are exposed to. How's that playing out in Glendale?
So we started student voice panels at our high schools, and soon after the conversation started, it rose to the occasion of really being very frank about race, ethnicity, and the way some of our students felt about the way they were being treated in our school district. So we took the opportunity and our board passed a resolution in January to look at anti-bias curriculum, to have a different history, social science adoption. We've now launched an email address for those who want to participate in the culturally relevant and responsive education group. And hundreds of individuals from our community have submitted their names. So that will go hand in hand with the implicit bias work that Dr. Harper has allowed us to do with him and to learn together. I think it starts with the students. We had virtual protests and we had protests on our streets.
Can you tell us what a virtual protest looked like?
Yes, schools organized and students were speaking up and how Flipgrids and every possible use of technology tools that I was not necessarily familiar with. I had to hurry up and learn to stay on task with our students. But what matters most is there is no fear for them to speak up. So then all the adults in the community are really recognizing that things have to change. And we are moving fast and furious to scrub our curriculum, to introduce strategies, to have student voice as part of Student Senate, which one of our high schools has been actively involved with. We've invited alumni back who have spoken about how they felt when they were at our schools, because they went to college and then realized and reflected of the environment in which they had to learn and how that impacted their ability to learn well and whether they felt a sense of belonging or not. So there's quite a bit of dialogue going on. It's our role to make sure that student and family voices are heard. And we have most recently met with our Teachers Association to introduce the learning as a family and school district together with the support of CTA as well. So it's not one-dimensional. We're also working with our city of Glendale. We're also working with our community college. This dialogue is a citywide dialogue, and that's what I'm trying to say, because influencing it just from the school district perspective is artificial and disingenuous.
Thank you for that. So Dr. Harper, you've been mentioned a number of times now as helping these districts. What does that look like? How do you have such sensitive conversations with teachers and help them to become prepared to do this work with their students in a way that is meaningful and engaging? What's the approach?
Sure. One of the things that might surprise lots of people, I know that conversations about race and racism are extremely scary to lots of folks. They worry that they're going to be divisive or explosive. But the good news here is that many teachers and school leaders are actually prepared or ready, rather, to engage in those conversations. They just need help. They just need someone to model for them what it means to enter into these conversations that are long overdue. So that's a part of it. Another more important part of it, though, Dean Nogueira, as you know, is actually upskilling teachers and school leaders, not just on how to talk about race, but how to integrate race across the curriculum. I appreciated Austin's example of the one ethnic studies elective and then civics. We need both, right? People actually, educators want to do it, they just don't know how. So we have to create professional learning experiences that are focused not just on philosophy, but focused on actual skill building, problem solving, thoughtful planning, and strategic action.
Thank you for that. Mary Helen, you're both a parent and a neuroscientist. And as you think about what it takes to really engage kids, whether we're talking about the history of race in America or math and science, are there any suggestions you would provide about ways to do that that will keep kids' attention? Because we know if kids are bored, they'll just they just won't plug in. And just talking at kids for hours a day is probably not going to inspire many of them. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, and my thoughts about it also tie, all of this really comes together into one big ball of yarn around feeling safe, feeling agentic and powerful and like you have a voice, And then that's setting the stage for really engaging kids in deep experiences of learning. So you can sort of think of the brain as kind of like a seesaw. And the pivot of the seesaw in the middle is kind of your emotional reactivity. It's that you do when you make a mistake or when you're worried. And it's also that you do when something really bad happens or something, that you see really shocks you or upsets you. And when you're in that stage, you shift your attention into like, what do I do? What right here, right now, right? And what that does is puts you in a place where you're aggressive, you're likely to really act, and you're not inclined sort of neurologically or physiologically to think deeply about things, to re-examine stuff that you can't see right in front of you here and now, right? And all of this that we're talking about, all of this really deep-seated racism and grief and worry that we have right now are all the stuff that is in stories we tell ourselves in our mind about how we're interrelating, what our historical context is. These are not things you can physically see by looking around you unless you know what to look for, which means you have a sense of what's behind these actions. And that hidden stuff that's behind, you can't access mentally unless you're in a neurological place where you feel safe enough to tip the seesaw the other way, where your reaction goes, I need to think about this more. Let me listen to you. Let me think about my own actions and experiences and what they reveal about what I really believe or what the systems are or the intentions are behind things. And our data and others suggest it's in the ability to move the seesaw back and forth in accordance with the importance of the information and the activities that you're being engaged in that we really develop healthy mental habits, healthy brain networks over time, and well-being in relationships and culturally in our communities. And so what this really looks like in terms of educational opportunities for kids is we need to design opportunities to do both things really strategically. We need kids to notice the importance and then dig in on stuff, get excited about stuff, engage with stuff, notice things, listen to us, engage in conversations. And then we also need to design projects and other kinds of activities and discussions and forums for them. It sounds really like the stuff going on in Glendale fits this really nicely, where they have supported opportunities to then assimilate, coordinate, integrate, synthesize, think together about what does this all mean, where it's not about what am I doing with this right now, but it's about let's sit together in a safe space and actually tell ourselves more and more complex, nuanced stories about why and what's possible in the future and how we're going to plan for that. And so really our mental well-being, our cultural well-being, and our learning opportunities all need to be synergistically feeding each other around this kind of seesaw where we're moving our teachers and our kids into engage and then notice when it's time to step back and make sense. And if kids are really supported in doing that through certain kinds of project-focused learning that is in real-world conversations about all the super important stuff that we're dealing with as a democracy right now, when you really engage people deeply in those conversations in a way that they feel like it matters, you are setting them up for neurological health and development and also for learning.
So a quick question on that. TikTok, YouTube, they seem to have found a way to keep kids engaged. Should we be learning from them as we think about how to use distance learning to get kids?
I am so glad you asked that. And here's the thing. Think about how TikTok and Snapchat and WhatsApp and all that stuff keeps you engaged. It does something that the brain is highly tuned to. It makes something really salient, right? That pivot in the middle goes, and then you tip which way? You tip into it, right? You tip into it and you're like, feed me, feed me, feed me, feed me, right? And then here's the thing. The way we use our brains over time is strengthening them in patterns of practice that we're going to be more likely to sort of crave and fall into later. So the more we engage in that feed me, feed me, feed me, right? Let me grab you with something exciting and feed you some more, right? The more we teach kids and brains that this is what we actually should be looking for in the world. And it's potentially undermining the development of that internal mode of thinking, which is where the real growth and understanding happens, where things like identity development, relationship development, deep understanding of historical context, and possible futures are invented, right? That space of out-of-the-box, sort of unstructured thinking, where we work together to envision something that doesn't exist now, that kind of thinking is directly undermined, the neuroscience suggests, by these kinds of engaging activities that grab your attention and keep you coming back for more, but in a very action-oriented, sort of superficial way.
Could I follow up on that one, Pedro? And not as a challenge to Mary Helen, but let me give you the flip of this, because I think this is a good topic we're on. When students are in a physical classroom, we assume they're engaged in learning. Not all are, but we assume because they're there. We assume because it's a captive audience. We assume because we turned off their device, and they may not be able to look out the window. When they go home, none of those conditions exist. And so we've tried to flip it on its head and say, how do we go about meeting students where they are? Not where we'd like them to be, but where they are. And we piloted some things which show us a path of what we might be able to use with this connection. We now, for the first time in all of our lives, we have a one-on-one connection with every student, or one on many, or many on one. We did something with Snapchat. Alicia Keys talked to the students on Snapchat about her story and a book that was meaningful to her, Brown Girl Dreaming. And we brought in philanthropy, and we had, within 12 hours, 500 students download that book, and they're participating, they're engaged. And so I think it's important that we don't bring them right away to where we'd like the world to be, or what we as adults can have this conversation and recognize we got to meet our students where they are. And our students are on Snapchat, TikTok, or Facebook, or where it is, and we need to bring them into this conversation. But if we can meet them where they are, I think we've got a better chance to bring them back into this and some of the deeper conversation we want to have. But if we start with the spinach, it's going to be the adults having a conversation. I'm not sure our students will join us right away.
So you make a really, really important distinction that I should have made clear.
Vivian next.
Sorry?
Go ahead, Mary Helen. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, you make a really important distinction, and that is that there's nothing inherently good or evil about these platforms. It's how you use them, right? So sure, if you partner with Snapchat around a deep conversation about a book that's really meaningful personally to somebody and engage kids in that content, right? Then what you're really using is the platform as a dissemination method of information that is then so compelling and important and well designed that it facilitates kids getting on board with a bigger discussion that you don't do directly on Snapchat. You step back and you read the book for a while, and then you come back with a motivated reason to be here. So it's a terrific example of exactly that seesaw I'm talking about. Pull them in with something that is designed to make it really compelling to step back out and spend some time on the other side reflecting, and then come back again to have that next discussion, because now you're prepared, you've done your reflections, you've done your reading. And so thinking about how we leverage these technologies, exactly, they're not going away, and they're terrific in terms of the amount of connectivity they provide and information access they provide, right? If we can think about how to leverage them in experiment designs, lesson designs, right? Just like yours, that actually really just compel kids to engage in both sides of the meaning-making process, the engagement and the listening, and then the meaning-making afterward, then you've got something really powerful.
Okay, Vivian, then Shaun, and then I'm going to start to wrap it up.
I just wanted to address the fact that the conversations around race and equity are multi-generational conversations too, in a city like Glendale. And the circumstances highlight the inequities that have existed for a long time. So you can live in a city where within the last 30 years, the diversity of city has gone from possibly 2 to 3 races to 50, all living together. And the hesitation to have conversations around equity because adults just don't know or haven't been taught how to. So the adult learning that has to occur simultaneously so that what is being discussed at school actually also impacts what is happening at home is really important. And that's why context really matters. but the continuous learning that has to occur is really significant in settings like ours.
So just before I get to you, Shaun, on that point about leadership, we didn't have a lot of time to prepare teachers before, but now we've had the summer, but at the same time we're preparing teachers to deliver meaningful lessons. We've also got teachers who themselves are stressed out, who themselves have kids at home and are juggling these duties. How are you approaching working with your teachers and recognizing that they too are under stress?
So I think mental health support is important for all of us, and having courageous conversations about how we can help each other really influences our ability to create a healthy environment. One example would be bring your kids to school if they are at home so that they can be in an environment where you feel you don't have to worry about them. Another, of course, from at least the last 4 months of working from home, because if they were able to do it. Technology support that we're trying to enhance so that they're not struggling trying to teach distance learning without those tools necessary. More professional learning and the opportunity to have discussions around how we can help them. I had 50 teachers by invitation write to me of what worked and what didn't work. Having their voices as part of the planning for the fall is essential.
Dr. Harper, if you'd like to jump in here.
Sure. I appreciated that we spent a portion of this time thinking creatively about how technological resources can be leveraged. Austin, I thought that story that you told was particularly good and useful. I've been thinking in a different way about the leveraging of technologies. I would love to see more educator activism in defense of science, using hashtags and all of our social media platforms. Just imagine if teachers and school leaders all across America joined together in defense of science, in defense of facts, in defense of public health, as we make our decisions about the format in which and the timeline on which we're going to return to school. I am convinced that we could actually make a difference in the decision making that's coming out of Washington and out of particular state houses. I'm not talking just about employee unions, but I'm talking about all of us coming together to say this is enough, this is absurd. We are absolutely insisting on facts. It feels to me, and sorry if this sounds judgmental, but it feels to me a bit lazy, perhaps even paradoxical in some ways, right? That educators are the people who facilitate learning. Don't we have a responsibility to come together to help our nation learn what the facts are as we think about schooling moving forward? I don't know. I just think that we have a real opportunity, especially given that so many educators have a Facebook account, have Twitter accounts, and Instagram. I think that we all could come together in a really extraordinary way to demand that we return to schools in ways that are consistent with what the science tells us is right.
Thanks.
Science fact, not science fiction.
Go ahead, Austin.
I was going to say science fact, not science fiction.
Right.
And boy, what would kids learn from that, right? When they see their teachers as learners working together to make a difference in their world and to impact the power structures, that's like actions are greater than words, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What a great time to teach kids how to distinguish between fake news and real news and how to check sources. And so lots of opportunities, even in this moment, for deepening understanding, deepening critical thinking. I want to thank you all for raising so many important issues. This theme of not returning to normal. We know it's not going to be normal come when schools reopen, but how can it be better? And I think we've gotten a lot of really good suggestions here. This is just the first of a series we're going to do on these topics related to the reopening of schools, ways in which we can address some of the critical issues facing our educators, our parents, and the kids themselves. I want to thank you all. We just heard while we were doing this webinar, the governor announced that they will require a mask in districts where the infection rate is above 5%. So they must have heard you, Austin, when you made that comment. That's a good sign. We're going to rely on science. So I do want to say, at a moment of so much uncertainty, to bring your voices out and to have it rooted in what we know from practice, what we know from research, is very reassuring, I'm sure, to many of the parents that are out there. Rossier School of Education wants to make itself available as a resource to all of the districts. We're going to put information out there on our website for how you can address these critical issues of race, how you can do distance learning well, how we can support our essential workers, who in many cases are the parents of our most vulnerable children. So I want to thank each of you for your time today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of this discussion. And I wish you all the very best as we continue on this journey in this very uncertain time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you.